This episode of The Trail Went Cold is brought to you by Away. Away makes first-class luggage at coach prices that allow you to charge your phone on the go. For $20 off a suitcase, go to awaytravel.com/cold and use the promo code COLD. Enjoy the show. September 12th, 1982. Lewiston, Idaho. 21-year-old Kristina Nelson and her 18-year-old stepsister, Jacqueline Brandy Miller, leave Kristina's apartment to go to the grocery store, but never return. That very same night, 35-year-old janitor Steven Pearsall vanishes after being dropped off at his workplace, the Lewiston Civic Theatre, where Kristina had previously held his job. The disappearances are believed to be connected, and a year and a half later, Kristina and Brandy's remains are found at the bottom of a ravine. Investigators explore the possibility that these crimes are connected to two other cold cases from the area, the 1979 disappearance of 12-year-old Christina White and the 1981 murder of 22-year-old Kristin David. But even though there is a promising person of interest who links the cases together, no one is ever charged with the Lewis-Clark Valley murders. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we've got a doozy of a story to cover today. The Lewis-Clark Valley Murders. The date of this episode's release is October the 30th, and it's always been a yearly tradition for our podcast to cover a special case on our last episode before Halloween. This year I thought long and hard about which case to cover and pondered a number of potential candidates, but I ultimately settled on the Lewis-Clark Valley murders because, quite frankly, this entire story is pure insanity. I have seen it featured on a couple of documentaries and TV shows, but I have not seen too many true crime podcasts attempt to tackle this one, which is why I decided to select it for The Trail Went Cold. This is a complicated saga about 5 separate victims who, during one 3-year period, were either murdered or went missing within the Lewis-Clark Valley, an area which is located on the Washington-Idaho state border and garnered its name because the famous Lewis and Clark expedition camped there during the early 19th century. It is comprised of 2 separate counties and is anchored by the cities of Lewiston, Idaho and Clarkston, Washington, which are separated by the Clearwater and Snake Rivers. What really makes this story stand out is that 3 of the victims disappeared on the same night, and they may have all been murdered inside the same building, the Lewiston Civic Theatre. In some circles, this case is referred to as the Lewis-Clark Valley serial killer because there is a person of interest who was the last known person to have seen some of the victims alive, and a number of people believe that he may have been responsible for all of these murders. This story was featured last year on a true crime docuseries called Cold Valley on the Investigation Discovery Network, but I should add this disclaimer. Because of geo-blocking restrictions, I haven't actually been able to watch this series in Canada, so I apologize in advance if it contained any crucial information which I neglect to mention on this episode. However, I've used a number of different sources to research this story, and I will thoroughly explore all 5 of these unsolved cold cases. But before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the insane saga of the Lewis Clark Valley murders. Our story begins in 1982 in Lewiston, Idaho, a town of approximately 28,000 located in Nez Perce County, right next to Washington State. Two of our central figures are 21-year-old Kristina Nelson and her 18-year-old stepsister, Jacqueline Miller, who goes by the nickname Brandy. They both originally hailed from Boise, but have moved to Lewiston in order to attend Lewis Clark State College. On the evening of September the 12th, the two stepsisters were hanging out together in Kristina's basement apartment before they left at around 10 p.m. Earlier that day, they told friends they were planning to go to the local Safeway store to do some grocery shopping. Kristina also left a note for her boyfriend, mentioning that she wanted to stop by a nearby apartment building she used to live at in order to put some towels in their dryer. But Kristina and Brandy would not be seen at the Safeway that night, and they subsequently vanished without a trace. By the time September the 14th rolled around, Kristina had still not returned to her apartment, so her boyfriend reported her missing. Both of the stepsisters' purses, checkbooks, and contact lenses were left behind at the apartment, as well as Kristina's cat and 10-speed bicycle. Residents at the apartment building where Kristina was planning to dry her towels would claim that they saw some towels folded up and resting on top of a dryer the day after Kristina went missing. But by the time police looked into this, the towels were gone, and no one ever admitted to taking them. And believe it or not, another Lewiston resident would go missing on the exact same night. The victim in question was 35-year-old Steven Pearsall, a former corporal with the United States Air Force who is now working as a janitor and set builder at the Lewiston Civic Theatre. After spending a portion of the evening at a party, Steven asked his girlfriend to drop him off at the theater because he wanted to use their washer and dryer to do some laundry, and he planned to pass the time practicing his clarinet while he waited. Steven's girlfriend dropped him off shortly after midnight on September the 13th, and both she and a passing patrol officer would confirm seeing him walk through the side door. Steven was never seen again, but while his clarinet was found inside the theater, the duffel bag he was carrying, which contained his dirty laundry, was missing. Steven also left behind his car, and an uncashed paycheck was found inside his apartment. Kristina and Steven both happened to live in basement apartments only 3 houses away from each other on the same block. It was established that Steven knew the two missing stepsisters, as Kristina attended the same art classes with them at Lewis Clark State College, and both she and Brandy had worked at the Lewiston Civic Theatre part-time. In fact, Kristina had previously worked Steven's job as a janitor. The investigation into the 3 disappearances would remain at a complete standstill for a year and a half when a shocking discovery was made on March the 19th, 1984. A teenager was collecting some cans off of Idaho State Highway 3 in Latah County near the town of Kendrick at an embankment located nearly 30 miles northeast of Lewiston. By pure chance, his hat was accidentally knocked off his head by a tree branch and rolled about 50 feet down the steep ravine. When he went down there to retrieve it, he was shocked to discover the decomposed remains of 2 women. They were eventually identified as Kristina Nelson and Brandy Miller. A forensic examination was made by a pathologist who was able to conclude that Brandy had been murdered, but he could not determine an exact cause of death for Kristina. The victim's clothing and a piece of severed rope was found near their bodies, and the rope wound up being a crucial piece of evidence. At the time the women went missing, the Lewiston Civic Theatre had been preparing a production of The Pirates of Penzance, and it would turn out the ropes were very similar to cordage that was used to build a prop ship for the production. This seemed to suggest that Kristina and Brandy had gone inside the theater on the night they went missing, which happened to be the same location where Steven Pearsall was last seen on the same night. Since Steven could still not be found, there was speculation that perhaps he had murdered the 2 victims and gone on the run. However, virtually everyone who knew Steven had a hard time believing this, as he was described as being a shy, soft-hearted, and easygoing person who pretty much had a big brother type of relationship with Kristina and Brandy. Considering that almost all of Steven's personal items, including his car, were left behind, investigators agreed that he was most likely a victim too. They theorized that he may have unknowingly walked in on the two women being murdered inside the theater before he was subsequently murdered himself because he was a witness. Well, investigators started exploring the possibility that this crime might be connected to two other unsolved cold cases which had taken place within the Lewis-Clark Valley during the previous 5 years. The first one occurred in Asotin, Washington, a small town of less than 1,000 people located right next to the Idaho state line, just 7 miles southwest of Lewiston. Since Asotin County borders Nez Perce County, the area is considered to be part of the Lewis-Clark Valley. On April 28, 1979, 12-year-old Christina White attended the parade for the Asotin County Fair and was planning to meet her best friend at the fairgrounds to help her prepare a horse. But at 2 p.m., Christina phoned her mother, Betty Eminger, and told her that she was at her friend's house because she was feeling sick from the heat. She asked her mother to come pick her up, but Betty did not have access to a car at that time. So she instructed Christina to put a wet washcloth on her neck and rest in the shade. When she started feeling better, Christina could then wheel her 10-speed bicycle and walk 5 blocks to a street corner where she would be visible to Betty from their home 2 blocks away. But after Christina hung up, her mother never heard from her again. Betty soon walked to the street corner where they had agreed to meet, but Christina never showed up. Christina's bicycle, which she had received as a birthday gift only 8 weeks earlier, was also never found. Christina's disappearance prompted her father, Gary White, to travel all the way to Asotin from the town of Payette, Idaho. Unfortunately, when Christina's parents attempted to report her missing to the Asotin County Sheriff's Office, they would not launch an investigation until she was missing for at least 72 hours. This meant that Christina's family pretty much had to look for her themselves, and Gary White even chartered a helicopter in order to perform a search. Gary suspected that an employee from the Asotin County Fair might have been responsible for Christina's disappearance, and he even went so far as to follow them from town to town to explore potential leads, but there was nothing to suggest that anyone associated with the fair was involved. Nearly 1 year later, Christina's school papers, which she had been carrying with her at the time she vanished, were found scattered in a field on the outskirts of Asotin. Interestingly enough, they were located near a horse pasture, which the mother of Christina's friend often rented for her horse to use. The papers were also in perfect condition, which suggested they could not have been out in the elements for nearly a year, and that someone had planted them there shortly before they were found. At one point, self-proclaimed psychic detective Dorothy Allison, who was profiled on one of the earliest episodes of Unsolved Mysteries, was brought in to assist the investigation. However, she failed to generate any promising leads, and the local sheriff would later say that the only thing she accomplished was turning Christina's family against the sheriff's office. 2 years after Christina went missing, the Lewis-Clark Valley would be shaken by another harrowing crime. On June 26, 1981, 22-year-old Kristin David, a broadcast journalism and political science major at the University of Idaho, left her apartment in the town of Moscow on her 10-speed bicycle in order to travel to Lewiston, but she never arrived and was subsequently reported missing. 8 days later, a fisherman discovered a garbage bag floating in the Snake River about 6 miles west of Clarkston. When he opened it, he was horrified to discover that it contained a headless female torso and a leg. Shortly thereafter, more plastic bags were found downriver, which contained a female head, arms, and part of another leg. It wasn't long before the remains were positively identified as Kristin David. The first garbage bag was found near the Red Wolf Crossing Bridge, so it was suspected that her killer had dumped the bags into the river from there. The condition of the remains showed that Kristin had been stabbed several times before she was dismembered, but her clothing and her bicycle were never found. Kristin had last been seen biking down U.S. Highway 95 on the day she disappeared, and after being placed under hypnosis, a witness recalled seeing Kristin speaking to an unidentified man who was driving a dark brown van with Oregon license plates. The following year, Notorious serial killer Henry Lee Lucas was looked at as a possible suspect in the crime, and his longtime accomplice, Otis Toole, would even confess to murdering Kristin. But as you probably know, Lucas and Toole were both notorious for falsely confessing to over 100 murders they did not commit. They were eventually ruled out as having any involvement in Kristin's death, as well as the murders of Kristina Nelson and Brandy Miller as well. But while there was no definitive evidence to suggest the cases were all connected, their close proximity to one another caused genuine fear that a serial killer might be operating in the Lewis-Clark Valley and had murdered at least 5 people. However, in 1995, authorities announced that they had a very strong person of interest who could be linked to the disappearances of Christina White, Kristina Nelson, Brandy Miller, and Steven Pearsall. One police captain was even quoted as saying, "We're 99% certain who the culprit is." While he was not publicly named at that time, a documentary about the case was produced in 2011 titled Confluence and revealed that the person of interest name was Lance Jeffrey Voss. Voss, who was 34 years old at the time, also happened to work at the Lewiston Civic Theatre in 1982. Like Steven Pearsall, Voss was a set builder, and on September the 12th, the two men had actually been working together on the sets for the upcoming production of The Pirates of Penzance. Voss told police that Steven left the theater to go to a party at around 9 p.m., and about a half hour later, Voss went out to get some dinner at a local pizza parlor called the Red Baron. Voss then said he returned to the theater at around 11 o'clock because he wanted to finish some rigging on the set, but he fell off the rafters and hurt his back. This prompted Voss to go to the green room and lie down on the couch, but he wound up falling asleep and did not wake up until 4 a.m. on the morning of September the 13th. He then phoned his wife to let her know where he was before heading home. Even though Steven Pearsall had been seen entering the theater shortly after midnight, Voss claimed that he did not see or hear anything and was asleep the entire time. But of course there were a number of discrepancies in his story. For example, Voss claimed that the John Carpenter-directed horror movie, The Fog, was playing on television at the Red Baron, and that he stayed there to watch the film all the way to the end. Well, both the TV guide and the TV listings in the Lewiston Tribune did confirm that The Fog aired that night, but it actually ended at midnight, only minutes before Steven was seen entering the theater. So if Voss watched the entire movie, it seemed unlikely he could have made it back to the theater and gone to sleep on the couch before Steven arrived. Luminol was used to test for the presence of blood, but the problem is that there was a lot of lead paint inside the theater, which usually generates the same reaction to luminol as bloodstains do, so the tests were inconclusive. While alarm bells started going off, once it was discovered that Voss had a connection to Christina White's disappearance and was the last person to see her alive. You see, in 1979, Voss was living in Asotin, and his girlfriend, who eventually became his wife, just happened to be the mother of Kristina's best friend. At the time, Voss and his girlfriend lived in separate houses only a few blocks apart, but he would often come over to her house, and it turned out Voss was there when Kristina came over and phoned her mother to complain about being sick from the heat. In fact, Voss admitted to giving Kristina the wet washcloth to put around her neck, but maintained that he had no idea what happened to her after she left the house. The brother of Kristina's friend had also been present at the house that day and verified that he had seen her throwing up and sitting under the tree in the front yard. While Voss started raising red flags when he volunteered to participate in the search effort for Kristina after she went missing, but he seemed overly enthusiastic about it, and if police were planning to search a specific area, Voss would often suggest searching other locations which were far away from them. Believe it or not, Voss actually showed up to one of the search parties with a washcloth wrapped around his neck. Investigators also explored the possibility that Voss might have also been responsible for Kristin David's murder, but while there was nothing to conclusively link him to the crime, there were a few tentative connections between Voss and the victim. Since Kristin wanted to go into TV production, she had worked at the Lewiston Civic Theatre in the past while Voss was employed there, so they likely did cross paths. At the time, Voss also worked as a delivery man who sometimes delivered to the Twin City Foods plant where Kristin held a summer job, and he often drove the same route from Moscow to Lewiston that Kristin was traveling on the day she went missing. Voss was interviewed about these cases by police on multiple occasions, and one investigator would describe Voss's behavior during his questioning as, quote-unquote, overly dramatic, and that he often gave off a, quote-unquote, staged reaction. Voss also turned down the request for him to take a polygraph on 2 occasions. Now, at one point, police asked Voss to provide his DNA in regards to an investigation involving the murders of a number of sex workers which were taking place in Spokane, Washington during that time period. Voss happily cooperated, and of course, years later, the perpetrator of these murders was identified as serial killer Robert Lee Yates. But when asked to provide his DNA in regards to the investigation into the Lewis-Clark Valley murders, Voss lawyered up and refused to cooperate, and he even attempted to sue the police for harassment. Voss wound up moving to North Carolina in 1999, and he still resides there today. There is a lot of other crazy stuff in Voss's background, but I'll delve further into that in a little while. But for clarification, the DNA evidence which Voss submitted for the Spokane murders was limited only to that case and legally restricted from being used as evidence in any other cases, so it has since been destroyed. Anyway, in 2017, the Lewiston Police Department announced a renewed push into the investigation as the Nez Perce County Prosecutor's Office had instructed a cold case unit to review the case in hopes of performing new DNA testing on some of the evidence. They hoped that if they were able to find some DNA evidence which belonged to an unknown male profile, this could provide them with legal grounds to get a DNA sample from any potential male suspects. And of course, last year saw the release of Cold Valley, the investigation discovery documentary series about the case, which I talked about in the intro. The current lead investigator is Asotin County Sheriff's Detective Jackie Nichols, and the series explored the efforts of both her and Kristina Nelson's cousin, Gloria Bobberts, to keep these cases in the spotlight and hopefully get them solved someday. As for the Lewiston Civic Theatre, the building has since been condemned, but efforts are still being made to restore it and save it from being torn down. However, the crimes associated with the theater continue to remain cold cases, as the murders of Kristina Nelson, Brandy Miller, and Kristin David are still unsolved, while Christina White and Steven Pearsall are still missing persons who have never been found. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to talk about our newest sponsor, Away, as we are very excited that they are now supporting The Trail Went Cold. Away makes affordable, high-quality suitcases that are not only ideal for packing, but also give you the option to charge your phone. By cutting out the middleman, Away is able to offer the perfect luggage made with high-quality materials at a much lower price. It comes in a variety of colors and 4 sizes: the carry-on, the bigger carry-on, the medium, or the large. Away has designed the perfect suitcase to make your travel experience stress-free. The carry-on bags feature 2 USB ports and a high-capacity battery that allows you to charge multiple devices on the go. Not just phones, but also tablets and laptops, so you never have to worry about dealing with a dead phone or getting into a fight for an outlet at the airport. As you might know, I've done a bit of traveling these past few years to go to podcasting events, and this requires not only a lot of usage of my cell phone, but my laptop as well, since I often find myself working on podcast scripts on flights or while waiting at the airport. So you can understand why I'm very grateful to be able to use my own suitcase to charge my devices. The suitcases are ultra durable, yet lightweight, with 4 360-degree spinner wheels that won't get stuck or break, and they're also theft-proof and contain a patent-pending interior compression system that tightly buckles in bulky items if you're an overpacker. It comes with a lifetime warranty, so if anything breaks, Away will fix or replace it for life. Away has a special offer just for listeners of the show. For $20 off a suitcase, go to awaytravel.com/cold and use the promo code COLD at checkout. Plus, get free shipping anywhere in the lower 48 states. That's $20 off a suitcase by going to awaytravel.com/cold and entering the promo code COLD. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the episode. Yeah, this is a pretty unbelievable story, and when you look at the entire situation as a whole, it's somewhat surprising that it's not more well known. Yes, it was extensively covered on the Cold Valley docuseries last year, as well as an episode of the true crime TV show Dark Minds, which they titled The Phantom of the Civic Theatre. In addition, you can also watch Confluence, the aforementioned 2001 documentary about the case, which is available for viewing on Vimeo. But overall, I'd wager that if you asked most true crime fans about the Lewis-Clark Valley murders, they wouldn't know what you were referring to. Now, I've done my fair share of cold cases on the podcast, in which there was an obvious suspect who had probably gotten away with murder, and everyone pretty much knew that they did it, but there just wasn't enough evidence to make an arrest. But here, we have a person of interest who could very well be a full-fledged serial killer and has gotten away with the murders of at least 4 or 5 people, possibly even more. If Lance Jeffrey Voss is a truly innocent man who has never harmed anyone, then he has to be the most cursed, unlucky person alive to have had so many people either go missing or die under mysterious circumstances after they've crossed paths with them. At the time of this recording, Voss is only a few weeks away from turning 72 years old, but as far as I can tell, he has only been arrested one time in his life, and as I'm going to discuss momentarily, even that incident is enough to give you an uneasy feeling about this guy. From everything I've read about Voss, people who knew him considered him to be a very weird, eccentric dude. It sounds like the Lewis-Clark Valley is a pretty tight-knit community, so I can't imagine how uncomfortable it must have felt to have someone like Voss living among them, knowing that he may have been responsible for the murders of multiple people, but without stronger evidence, law enforcement was powerless to do anything about it. What's crazy is that evidence has recently been uncovered to suggest that Voss may have committed his first murder when he was only 15 years old. On August 1st, 1963, Diane Taylor, an 8-year-old girl living in the Austin Heights area of Chicago, went missing after leaving the local YMCA. 2 days later, Diane's nearly nude body was found in some weeds next to an alley, and it turned out that she had been raped, beaten, slashed, and stabbed. Well, at this time, 15-year-old Lance Jeffrey Voss resided in the area and attended Austin High School. He lived only a couple miles away from Diane's apartment, and only about a block away from the YMCA where Diane disappeared from. Voss was interviewed during the investigation into Diane's murder, but since over 14,000 people were interviewed in total, it seems like there was nothing to make him stand out as a potential suspect. While there is no evidence to suggest that Voss committed the crime, it remains unsolved to this day. Now, the next incident I'm going to talk about is particularly weird. On June 2nd, 1972, a 17-year-old girl named Antoinette Anino had a heated argument with her boyfriend on the boardwalk in Santa Cruz, California, before she stormed away. The following day, Antoinette's nude body was found floating on the shore of a nearby beach. Her official cause of death was drowning, and it was ruled a suicide, since Antoinette had apparently made suicidal comments in the past. Anyway, her body was stored at the Willow Glen Mortuary in San Jose in preparation for burial, but 2 days later, the police received a call at 5 a.m. about a suspicious person who had been seen outside the mortuary chapel. When the police arrived, they found a young man who had removed the chapel's window screen and was carrying a flashlight, 12-inch knife, and a camera. Well, take a wild guess who it was. Lance Jeffrey Voss. He claimed that he wanted to spend the night with his girlfriend one last time, but Antoinette Anino was the only deceased person inside the chapel at that time, and of course, she was not actually his girlfriend. Anyway, Voss was arrested and charged with burglary, though he later pled guilty to the lesser charge of trespassing. But that's not all. On July the 27th, 1987, Claudette Volova, a 25-year-old hospice nurse, was found dead inside her Lewiston apartment after overdosing on medication in an apparent suicide. While Voss just happened to be the person who discovered her body, as Claudette had worked as a seamstress at the Lewiston Civic Theatre and met Voss when they acted together in a play there. Even though Voss was married, he had been carrying on an affair with Claudette for the past 2 years. While no evidence was found to suggest that foul play had taken place, this was yet another odd death which Voss had somehow become connected to. There was also an unsettling story from a female real estate agent who had visited Voss at his house in Asotin while he was trying to sell it in 1980. She said that Voss insisted on showing her the basement, but after she went downstairs, she turned around and saw Voss holding what appeared to be an object in his hand, and it looked like he was about to strike her. Voss then asked the agent how many people knew she was there, and when she replied several, he put the object down and started acting normally again. And here's one more bizarre incident which may have involved Voss. On previous episodes, I've sometimes made mention of the topics forums, which often contain lengthy threads about unsolved cold cases until the forum shut down for good in December of 2018. Anyway, these threads were often filled with unsubstantiated rumors and gossip, but in 2009, there was a lengthy discussion going on about the Lewis-Clark Valley murders, and a poster with the username Curious kept chiming in. He seemed to have a lot of inside knowledge about the cases, and kept sharing information which painted Voss in a favorable light. Curious claimed that Voss had been cleared as a suspect after a DNA test by the FBI, and denied the allegations that Voss had interacted with Christina White at her friend's house on the day she went missing. Well, needless to say, other posters were skeptical about the veracity of this information, and when they brought up the possibility that Curious was actually Lance Jeffrey Voss, or a relative of his, this brought an abrupt end to Curious's postings. While the topics forums are no longer around, a record of all of Curious's posts can be found on the website altereddimensions.net, and with everything I've heard about Voss, they do seem like the type of posts he would write. Of course, with all the suspicions surrounding Voss, online sleuths have attempted to link him to other unsolved cold cases which occurred in the Lewis-Clark Valley area during the time he lived there, as well as cold cases from North Carolina since Voss moved there in 1999. Here's one particularly bizarre example from Lewiston. On September the 21st, 1989, gravediggers at the Normal Hill Cemetery were preparing a plot for burial when they happened to come across some skeletal remains buried 2 feet in the ground without a casket. The remains belonged to an unidentified man who was believed to be in his mid-20s, and it was estimated that they were no older than 10 years old. Since a law had been enacted in the 1960s, which required all deceased subjects to be buried inside a vault or a casket at a cemetery, this victim had clearly not been given a legitimate burial. Now, the ironically named Normal Hill Cemetery is located just over a mile away from the Lewiston Civic Theatre, and I believe they did conclusively determine that the remains did not belong to Steven Pearsall, but to this day, the victim has still never been identified. Of course, I'm not suggesting that Lance Jeffrey Voss was the person who buried those remains, but it just seems like an awful lot of weird stuff was going on in Lewiston during the 1980s. Anyway, now we should start talking about the featured cases from this episode, which we know Voss does have a connection to. For years, it really didn't seem like the disappearances of Kristina Nelson, Brandy Miller, and Steven Pearsall were connected to the disappearance of Christina White, since they took place in different towns, and one of them involved a child. But then it turned out that Voss just happened to be present at the last location where these victims were seen alive, and if he was completely innocent, that would be an astronomical coincidence. There's nothing to definitively connect Voss to the murder of Christin David, but since it took place within the Lewis-Clark Valley during the same time period, this possibility has to be explored. But let's start off by talking about the 3 victims who went missing on the evening of September the 12th, 1982. We know that Lance Jeffrey Voss and Steven Pearsall can be placed inside the Lewiston Civic Theatre that night, as they were both working together on constructing a set before Steven left to attend a party at around 9 p.m. And we also know that Steven returned shortly after midnight because his girlfriend and a police officer saw him entering the building. Voss's story is that he left the theater at around 9:30 to have pizza at the Red Baron before he returned about an hour or two later, injured his back after falling off the rafters, and then fell asleep on the green room couch until 4 a.m. We know that Kristina and Brandy both vanished after leaving Kristina's apartment at around 10 p.m., but technically, we can't even be 100% certain that they went inside the theater. However, the main piece of evidence which links the 2 victims to the theater is the length of rope found near their bodies, as it seemed to match the cordage which was used to construct a prop ship in a theatrical production which was being prepared at the time they went missing. Since all 3 victims disappeared at the same time, and only Kristina and Brandy's bodies were found, I know investigators did have to explore the possibility that perhaps Steven murdered them, disposed of their bodies, and then went on the run, but this doesn't seem likely at all. From all accounts, no one who knew Steven had a bad word to say about him, but putting that aside, it just seemed unlikely Steven would have left behind an uncashed paycheck and his car if he took off. And from a practical standpoint, how exactly would Steven have traveled nearly 30 miles outside of Lewiston to dump the 2 bodies down a ravine if he didn't have his car? The prevailing theory from investigators is that Voss somehow lured Kristina and Brandy into the theater to murder them, and when Steven walked in there a short time later, he wound up witnessing something which led to him being murdered as well. Kristina was planning to put some towels into a dryer at a nearby apartment building, and while the towels were supposedly seen by some residents, they were never recovered. But it's possible that Kristina did put the towels in there and was planning to pick them up after she and Brandy went to the Safeway to get groceries. From what I've read, the route to the Safeway wouldn't have taken them past the Lewiston Civic Theatre, but it apparently would have taken them near the Red Baron, where Voss claimed he was having pizza that night. If Voss crossed paths with the 2 women, he could have used this opportunity to lure them to the theater. Since Kristina and Brandy had worked there before, and knew Voss personally, it could have been something as simple as Voss asking them if they wanted to see the new set he was working on for the upcoming show. If Steven, Kristina, and Brandy were all murdered inside that theater, then it is pretty crazy that the killer would be able to remove 3 bodies and dispose of them without being seen. They also did a pretty thorough job of it, as Steven is still missing, and the 2 women may never have been found were it not for the freak occurrence of a branch knocking off a teenage boy's hat into the bottom of the ravine. Since Steven's body was not found in the ravine, it's clear that the killer went to the trouble of disposing of him at an entirely different location. There's a good chance this was done in order to give off the false impression that Steven murdered the 2 victims before running off. While no one really believed that Steven was the killer, it could prove to be an effective strategy, because if anyone is ever charged with the murders of Kristina and Brandy while Steven is still a missing person, a good defense lawyer could use that fact to generate reasonable doubt and convince a jury that Steven did it. Now, Voss's alibi for the night in question has never been particularly convincing, as he claimed he was sleeping on a couch inside the green room for most of the night. This means that if Voss wasn't involved, he somehow managed to sleep through whatever happened to the 3 victims inside the theater. People who have been inside the building say that it has very good acoustics, so it seems unlikely that someone could not be awakened if there was a bunch of noise. Also, the side door where Steven was seen entering the theater would have taken him right past the couch Voss claimed he was sleeping on. And given that this is a Halloween episode, I suppose it's only appropriate that a John Carpenter film is a key piece of evidence in this case. As you recall, Voss claimed that the movie The Fog was playing on television while he was eating at the Red Baron, and that he watched it all the way to the end, but the problem is that it aired until midnight. It just seems impossible that Voss could have made it back to the theater, fallen off the rafters, and then fallen asleep on the couch before Steven was seen walking in through the side door. Voss said that when he woke up later that morning, he phoned his wife to let her know where he was, but she would say that this was the only time he had ever stayed out late like that without calling her. But the problem, of course, is that you need more than a shaky alibi to charge someone with murder. The theory that Voss lured Kristina and Brandy into the theater and subsequently murdered Steven when he walked in on the crime is the most logical conclusion, but with the evidence they have right now, it cannot be definitively proven. Aside from the length of rope found at the dump site, there is nothing which links the two female victims to the theater and proves they set foot inside there that night. As a side note, an investigator with the Lewiston Police Department would recount an incident where he met Voss at a mutual acquaintance's house, and the first thing Voss did was ask him completely out of the blue how the investigation into the two missing girls was going. It's also quite interesting to compare Voss's reactions when he was asked to submit DNA for this case and for the murders which were committed by the Spokane serial killer. Since we now know that Voss did not commit the Spokane murders, it's obvious that he had no qualms about providing his DNA for that investigation, but he has never agreed to submit his DNA for this one. So now let's talk about Voss's potential involvement in Christina White's disappearance, as learning that he was with Kristina right before she went missing was the big aha moment for investigators which linked these cases together. If you go back and read the original news accounts of this case, there's no indication that anyone else was with Kristina at the time she phoned her mother from her friend's house, so the revelation that Voss was there was a huge red flag. Now, at 12 years old, Kristina was younger than Voss's other alleged victims, but you can't overlook the fact that he was technically the last person to see her alive. We also have accounts of Voss being overly enthusiastic to participate in the search efforts for Kristina, which law enforcement says is not an uncommon practice for the perpetrators in missing persons cases. While Voss's role as a person of interest was not made public until many years later, Kristina's mother, Betty, said she immediately got a sick feeling when she saw Voss show up to a search party with a washcloth wrapped around his neck, which is exactly what Betty had instructed her daughter to do during their last phone conversation. At that particular point in time, I'm not sure the general public was even aware of the detail about the washcloth, so this would demonstrate Voss's sheer brazenness if he was guilty. Now, we know that the bicycle Kristina rode to her friend's house was also never found, but it's not hard to imagine Voss being able to get rid of it. Even though he often frequented his girlfriend's place, Voss lived in his own house only a few blocks away, so when he heard Kristina's phone call to her mother, he simply could have offered her a ride home, then used this opportunity to drive both Kristina and her bicycle to his house, where they could be concealed until he had the opportunity to dispose of them at a later time. One of the creepiest details of this case is how Kristina's school papers were found at a horse pasture nearly 1 year later, but were in nearly pristine condition. If the papers had been out in the elements the entire time Kristina was missing, there's no way they would have been in such good condition, so this means that Voss, or whoever the killer was, decided to hold on to them for several months before they planted them there. Again, the fact that Kristina's best friend, who would soon become Voss's stepdaughter, often used this particular horse pasture shows another act of pure brazenness from Voss if he's the killer. Now, while there are really strong links between Voss and the aforementioned cases, there is still uncertainty about whether or not he was responsible for the murder of Kristin David, and some investigators have expressed their belief that she was killed by an entirely different person. We know that Kristin did work at the Lewiston Civic Theatre at some point, and she was last seen traveling a route which Voss often used to make deliveries at the time. And much like the Christina White case, the victim's bicycle was never found. But unlike the other cases, there's nothing to conclusively link Voss to Kristin or place him in the area where she went missing. The one lead which points away from Voss is the eyewitness who thought he saw Kristin speaking to a man driving a dark brown van with Oregon license plates, as Voss did not own such a vehicle at that time. But this description was provided while the witness was under hypnosis, so it may not be 100% reliable, and even if it is, we can't even be certain that the driver of the brown van was the killer. I know that a number of brown vans were stopped and checked by law enforcement following Kristin's disappearance, and they turned up nothing. I will say that considering how carefully he concealed his other alleged victims, it does seem pretty extreme for Voss to have dismembered Kristin, placed her remains in separate garbage bags, and tossed them into the river. While the exact circumstances of how Kristina Nelson and Brandy Miller were killed are not quite clear, we do know that they did not die in this fashion. This is why I wouldn't be surprised if the crime was committed by some serial killer who was just passing through the area. I know that Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole were looked at as possible suspects, and Toole even made a confession, but really, are there any murders from the early 1980s which these guys didn't confess to? It sounds like Toole didn't share any specific details to suggest he had inside knowledge of the crime, so I wouldn't put too much stock into him. One potential alternate suspect is Harry Anthony Hantman, who had been committed to a psychiatric hospital in Washington, D.C. for the rape and murder of an 11-year-old girl before he escaped on Christmas Day in 1973. 20 years later, it was discovered that Hantman had been living in Oregon under a false identity, and he was recaptured at a motel in Lewiston. It turned out that Hantman had kidnapped and sexually assaulted a female student from the University of Oregon during his time on the run, and apparently, at least one investigator from the Lewiston Police Department was convinced that Hantman murdered Kristin David. However, there's really nothing to link Hantman to the crime, but if the perpetrator was not actually Voss, then it's terrifying to think there may have been a completely different killer operating in the Lewis-Clark Valley during that time period. So now we have to discuss the other three deaths which Voss has been linked to: the murder of Diane Taylor and the suspicious suicides of Antoinette Anino and Claudette Bulva. The connection to the Diane Taylor case has only been made in recent years, and is based largely on the fact that Voss happened to live in the same area back in 1963. It's a pretty brutal and heinous crime involving the rape and murder of an 8-year-old girl, and the idea that Voss may have done this when he was only 15 years old is pretty terrifying. I know he was interviewed by police, but so were over 14,000 other people, so that doesn't really mean anything. But here's a potentially interesting development. There is a Facebook page for the Lewis-Clark Valley serial killer, which is run by Kristina Nelson's cousin, Gloria Bobberts, who has spent several years researching and digging up information related to this case, including material about Voss's background. Not too long ago, she uncovered an old article from the Austin News, which showed a photograph of a crowd gathering in the alley when Diane's body was found. Standing in the bottom right-hand corner of the photo facing the camera is a young man who kind of looks like Lance Jeffrey Voss. The picture is too blurry to be certain if it's actually him, but given how anxious Voss was to participate in the search efforts for Christina White all those years later, it would not surprise me at all if he was brazen enough to hang around the scene of his very first murder. Overall, there's really nothing to conclusively prove that Voss committed this crime, but the good news is that this latest development compelled the Chicago Police Department to reopen the investigation for the first time in several decades, so who knows where this might lead. Now, the death of Antoinette Anino from 1972, we can definitely link Voss to this case, because he was flat out caught trying to break into the mortuary chapel where her body was being kept. As you recall, Voss claimed that he wanted to be with his girlfriend one last time, but since he was carrying a camera and a 12-inch hunting knife, God only knows what he was planning to do. Looking back, I find it curious that the police were so quick to write off Antoinette's death as a suicide. Sure, we don't really know anything about her background, and for all we know, an argument with her boyfriend could have been the breaking point which compelled her to drown herself. But considering that her body was found nude, some people, including Asotin County Sheriff's Detective Jackie Nichols, have since expressed their skepticism that Antoinette took her own life. Unless Voss really did have a deceased girlfriend at that time and attempted to break into the wrong mortuary, I don't quite see how he would have known Antoinette's body was in there. This is the only time that I know of that Voss has ever been arrested for something, but I have to wonder how much other twisted stuff he may have done, which we don't even know about. And finally, we have to talk about the death of Claudette Voliva, since it took place a few years after the Lewis Clark Valley murders, and her body was found by Voss after she overdosed. This is another woman who worked at the Lewiston Civic Theatre alongside Voss, and she carried on an affair with him, which lasted 2 years. Again, like Antoinette and Nino, this may legitimately be a suicide, since Claudette had a history of depression. But this case also features some more odd behavior from Voss. He was really into Dungeons & Dragons during this time period, and he constructed a hand-painting D&D figurine, which he gave to Claudette. Voss allegedly told someone else from the theater that Claudette had this figurine in her hand at the time he discovered her body, but there's apparently no truth to this at all. So even if Voss had no involvement in Claudette's death, why would he lie about something like that? Given that Voss is suspected of at least 4 or 5 murders, I guess it's tempting to pin virtually every remotely suspicious death he's ever been associated with on him, but it has to be said that the MO in a lot of these deaths is all over the place. Let's compare the 2 cases involving children. Diane Taylor was brutally murdered and left out in the open, while the killer of Christina White took great pains to hide her body. We have a missing man who has still not been found, 2 young women whose remains were found after they had been missing for a year and a half, and another young woman whose dismembered body parts were tossed in a river. And then there's 2 other women whose deaths were considered to be suicide via drowning and an overdose, though some suspect foul play. Does it really seem to you that the same person could have been responsible for all of these deaths? Well, I don't know if Voss murdered all these people, but at the very least, I believe he's responsible for the deaths of Kristina White, Kristina Nelson, Brandy Miller, and Steven Pearsall. It's frightening to think that Voss may be a full-fledged serial killer who has continued to live a seemingly normal life on the surface and get away with it, but since he's about to turn 72, at least he might be too old by this point to continue harming people. But as you all know, Joseph James DeAngelo, aka the Golden State Killer, was 72 years old when he was finally identified and arrested for his crimes, so anything's possible. At the very least, there are still 2 victims out there, Kristina White and Steven Pearsall, who need to be found and brought home, even if no one is ever charged with their murders. But maybe if their remains are recovered, this might give the authorities the final piece of evidence they need to make an arrest. So if you happen to have any information on the Lewis Clark Valley murders, please contact the appropriate authorities. However, if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we released a spooky Halloween-themed episode about the Ghost Blimp, a baffling World War II-era mystery about 2 Navy pilots who vanished without a trace from a blimp while it was in mid-flight. And for our patrons in tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take a moment to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are True Crime Nana, Mikkel Ann, The Rains of Yesteryear, Frederick S., Laura, and Kirkwood R. Thank you all so much for your support. And one more announcement. This past summer, we held a live watch-together party in which myself and several of our listeners viewed a marathon of Unsolved Mystery segments which were covered on The Trail Went Cold. Well, the whole event was a blast, so I'm pleased to announce that our next watch party is going to take place on Saturday, November the 9th at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I will be providing more details over the next 2 weeks, but mark that date down on your calendars. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode, and we've been playing his creepy Halloween-flavored version of the Trail Went Cold theme throughout the month of October. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and a fun Halloween, and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.